Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are coming to us today. Before we turn to today's webinar, two quick reminders. Tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, we are hosting the 4 Congressional Trade Councils for an in-person, off-the-record discussion at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. That session will also be streamed on Zoom, but no recording will be available, so you have to watch it in person or on Zoom. And we're going to have a coffee hour, a half hour before. So if you want to get it there a little early and do a little bit of trade networking in Washington, please join us at 9 a.m. for that in person at the Reagan Building tomorrow. Next Wednesday, March 13th, we're hosting a special webinar with our friends at the Asia Society Policy Institute to talk about Chinese investments in the Mexican auto sector. Information on both events can be found at www.wita.org. Last week, we hosted 2 briefings live from the WTO's Ministerial in Abu Dhabi. We packed a lot into those sessions and have a lot of ground to cover today, so we won't waste too much time with lengthy introductions. So please bear with us if this is a little bit less structured than our usual webinars. And we may, if we need to have a few extra minutes at the end, we may run over a little bit if there's still more to talk about or questions to ask. If you're watching this on Zoom, you should have received a copy of our program for today and a link to the speakers' bios by email. That should have come a little while ago, so we don't need lengthy introductions today. If you're watching on Zoom, you can also ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can today. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome on screen two longtime friends of WITA and friends of many of you in the audience, Angela Ellard, the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and our moderator, another friend of many of ours, Penny Naas of TradeExperettes. And after their discussion, we'll then welcome on our panel. Penny and Angela, welcome.
Great. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. Great to be here.
Angela, maybe why don't you give us your take and your perspective, your hot take, I guess it still is. Hot, but maybe slightly sleepy take for all of us coming back from that week. We'd love to get your impressions. Again, this is on the record and with a lot of folks on the line, but would welcome any of your observations at this stage. I turn it over to you.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, Penny. Pleasure to be here with you. And thanks, Ken, for hosting us. I'm glad that you're doing this event so fresh off of, so to speak, fresh off of MC13. I think all of us who were there are still having nap attacks. It was a pretty exhausting time, but well worth it, I think. I think that it's important to start off by recognizing that MC13 occurred against a rather difficult backdrop. Of course, continued war in Ukraine, Gaza as well. And in addition, we see shipping disruptions that have really had quite an effect on trade. In addition to this, we've seen higher prices for food and energy, and this has created a lot of political discontent, which has a tremendous effect, I believe, on members, on our WTO member countries as they approach to MC13. They have to take into account these domestic political considerations. In addition to that, of course, some 60 of our members are holding elections this year. And that's a tremendous chunk of the global population. So keeping that in mind as well, many of our members are under a very intense political microscope right now. So that backdrop, I think, is important to consider when looking at what happened at MC13. As we all know, our efforts this past week did not culminate in all of the outcomes that we had hoped for, but at the same time, we did deliver some very important achievements that are to be that should be acknowledged, and we've laid the groundwork for more. So basically what we've done is to build on the very strong foundation that our members developed at MC12, moving the ball forward, even in some cases, if not all the way, at least moving it forward considerably, and making sure that the WTO does in fact remain fit for purpose in a very much changing trade landscape. So let me tick through some of the key issues. With respect to dispute settlement, members sent a very strong political message in the form of a ministerial decision about the importance of the work that's been undertaken in Geneva since MC12, and the work that's been done so far, and renewing their commitment to achieving a full functioning dispute settlement system accessible to all by 2024, reaffirming that goal and instructing the Geneva ambassadors to accelerate their work. That's a very important development. In addition to this, there was also substantial work that was done, substantive and substantial work on special and differential treatment with respect to developing countries and least developed members. Our members agreed to a ministerial decision that would enable developing countries, particularly the least developed, to fulfill their WTO commitments, exercise their rights, better integrate into global trade. So that was very much an outcome. In fact, I heard one important delegation refer to MC13 as the development ministerial for that reason, as well as others. We also had a bit of a different format this time and created an opportunity for ministers to engage in specific discussions that aren't necessarily directly related to negotiations, but reflect that there are strong views with respect to two pressing issues that go to the heart of the political and economic and environmental challenges that we face. So sustainable development and socioeconomic inclusion. So this discussion was quite rich and lasted for several hours, giving ministers an opportunity to frame how they see the issues. We also concluded two accessions. So we have two new members to the WTO, Comoros and Timor-Leste, which is very important, I think, to show that members still want to join the WTO, and they see that membership in the WTO is a very important part of their economic development and a recognition of the world that they are part of the global rules of the road. A couple of other things I would note on fisheries subsidies. We were hoping to conclude a second wave agreement relating to subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. While we were not quite able to achieve that, we came so very close. And I think that the work that was done both before MC13 and during MC13 was enormously productive, tremendous engagement by the members, and that it lays out a path now for us to continue that work. In addition to this, I would say that because members were so focused on MC13 with respect to the first fisheries subsidies agreement, we saw many members want to do something productive, and many of them deposited their instruments of acceptance of that first agreement. We need 110, now we're up to 71. So we have just 39 remaining. And I think over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see a lot from those who couldn't quite make it at MC13. So that is very, very productive. I also want to mention agriculture. We were not able to conclude an agreement on agriculture. However, in a very important development, members were actually working off of a common text, and they were submitting textual suggestions off that text. So that is a very good beginning here that members hopefully will move along in Geneva to use this text as a framework for future negotiations. Then I would also mention the e-commerce moratorium and the work program to help developing members address the digital divide. So the moratorium will expire now as of March 2026 or MC14, whichever is earlier. And the moratorium is combined together with a work program to help developing members. So we're seeing members decided not to extend the moratorium in a permanent way, but nor did they decide to have it expire. And instead, this middle ground of allowing it to continue for another couple of years, combined with a really practical work program to help developing members. So why don't I stop there and see if there are questions or comments?
Yeah, great. Angela, I don't see any questions yet. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to weave them in and ask them to Angela. So Angela, a couple of questions for you from your sense of things. So with fisheries and with ag, what I couldn't quite tell was are these issues, they kind of ran as far as they could go and then got like really stuck in difficult political disputes or areas that were just really politically contentious for certain members, and so people need to go off and think about them further? Or did you just run out of time? How would you describe that?
Well, I think that these two issues that you highlight are very complex. I think that we could have used more time. On the other hand, some of the issues really are difficult politically. And sometimes it's best just to do what you can, to take the steps that you can, stop, regroup, take a look, try to figure out how to take the discussions, the negotiations further. So I don't think that we are, as you were reflecting in our call, that you used the phrase, are we stuck in a ditch? We're not stuck in a ditch. We are instead, I think we've advanced the work on both of those areas. And now it's up to our members to see what in Geneva, what will be the next steps. I think, particularly on fish, which I can talk to most directly because I was in those negotiations night and day, and have been for my entire tenure so far at the WTO. We came so very close. I mean, we are closer than we've ever been by a huge order of magnitude. But now I think many members expected that we might finish. We did not. There's still some concerns that some of the members are raising. But I wonder whether now at this point, having come so close, that there may be an opportunity to move it forward. I was really struck at the end of the closing ceremony when Fiji, the Deputy Prime Minister of Fiji, took the floor, asked for an opportunity to speak, even though it was not in the agenda, and spoke very movingly about how the Pacific Islands are the guardians of the Pacific, of fish stocks. 50% of the world's tuna stocks are in that area. And we didn't quite make it, but he was so persuasive in the need and begging ministers when they, when everybody goes back to capitals, back to Geneva, that we revitalize this work because fish stocks are becoming, the situation is becoming more and more dire. And then there was a group of about 20 members who then spoke out. It was this very spontaneous event that was quite moving. And I think that will be an impetus for further action.
Great, Angela. A couple of questions came in that are linked, and it was a topic you didn't touch on. One is the JSI on domestic services, and the other is the JSI on investment facilitation for development. Could you touch on, so domestic services, and for those that are not aware, these are agreements that were taken forward by a subset of members, and now there is a desire to try to incorporate them, I think, into the broader WTO framework via Annex 4. And domestic services regulation was able to get through. No one objected. So that now I think is coming into the WTO. But there was an objection to investment facilitation for development being also included, even though 126 with 123, 124 signing got done there. But because of 1 to 2 countries objecting, it is not currently being incorporated into the WTO. Could you touch on those two for us?
Sure. I'd be happy to. On the domestic services regulation, this agreement, we had a big celebration in Abu Dhabi, because this agreement now is entering into effect. The negotiations were concluded some time ago, but we needed to have a path for members to make it part of the rule book. And this was done through the changes to individual services schedules that would be undertaken by members. But 2 of our members had objected to this. They lifted the objection now, and so we are able to move forward on this plurilateral initiative and to see it enter into force and to begin to see the practical benefits. On investment facilitation for development, the good news there is that the text now has been agreed to. It was agreed to at the end of the year, at the end of last year. So we have a text. Now the question is, how does that text get included into the rule book? Because it is a plurilateral negotiation, and members are seeking to put that into the plurilateral, it's a plurilateral negotiation that members are now seeking to put into the multilateral rule book for those who are signing on. Huge number of developing members who are part of this, some 100 developing members. This just shows the intensity of interest and how developing members view this agreement as being investment facilitation, as making them more attractive for investment, and therefore being a tool for development. So the issues now in terms of the procedural steps, we're still working on that. Yes, there was an objection, but I think at the same time, the developing members who are so interested in this negotiation and the developed members will be pushing very hard to see if we can bring it to the next level.
Great. I think the one thing I would say about that, Angela, it seemed to me that developing countries are not a unified bloc in any way, shape, or form, and that there's different groups within the developing countries, whether it be the JSI or some of the other issues, where you could really see sometimes developing countries have very different opinions about some of the very substantive issues that were out there. And yes. So it was, in some cases, less developed versus developing, but developing versus developing on certain areas.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. We saw that also with respect to the e-commerce moratorium, where there are many developing members who do support the extension of the moratorium.
Yeah. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the sustainability issues? And there was a lot of talk there because the word climate change wasn't in the initial draft ministerial text, and I know a lot of people were trying to inject certain elements into climate change and sustainability. Kat, I just want to ask one more question, then we'll move on. But I wondered, Angela, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you saw the trade, climate change, and then some of the broader environmental issue, fossil fuel subsidies, plastics, et cetera, How you
Yes.
saw that all playing out from your perspective?
Well, I think these are the new issues of our times. And the WTO needs to be a part of these discussions. It needs to create a forum for these discussions, whether it is setting new rules, whether it is providing an opportunity for members to share experiences, to ask questions about each other's policies and how they approach questions of sustainability, and of course, development and inclusiveness. There are various approaches when it comes to sustainability as to how members might choose to address it, whether it's through tax policy, whether it's through subsidies, whether it's through regulatory policy, how all of this affects supply chains, and how this affects developing members who in many ways bear the brunt of climate change and also are concerned that they may not be included in supply chains for these products. So the discussion was quite intensive and rich on these points. And I think it gives a good foundation for members to continue talking about them. I should put in a plug for a document that the Secretariat issued at the time of COP28, a toolkit of 10 items, 10 different policy areas that members can look at when it comes to trade and sustainability. Some of them don't require negotiation. These are things that members may want to consider doing themselves, just unilaterally, in order to see some benefits. So I call your attention to that as well.
And if I could, can I ask one final question real quick?
Please.
One other question, Angela, that I didn't see mentioned or referenced so far, which was there was a lot of conversation about industrial policy and trade. And I don't know where that landed. I wondered if you could just comment on that, because I know that it also plays into some of the other issues around kind of the Green New Deal and subsidies that some members are giving. And I don't know if that discussion got parked or if that's part of these new topics that the WTO will look at how to take forward.
Yes, this is part of these new topics. We had a session dedicated to issues like this for ministers to speak at on our very first day. So that was the question of industrial policy is one aspect, I think, of how governments might relate to climate change, what types of policies that they may take. So it became part of that discussion, and it really has already been within the WTO for at least a year and a half, certainly since MC12. But I anticipate that this discussion will continue, whether it is in terms of, do we need to set new rules? Do we need to use our committee structure to have more engagement among members about domestic policies that they may undertake? And what are some of the development aspects and consequences of policies that developed members may undertake?
Angela, thank you so much. Ken, I think we've kept her for a good chunk, and Angela, we really appreciate your being on so quickly to provide your takes on this. Super helpful.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Angela. Always a pleasure to see you. We'll miss you tomorrow at the congressional event that we're having in DC, but maybe you can tune in. We'll have the team send you a link. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we now want to welcome on our panel to turn on their cameras: Christine Bliss, the president of the Coalition of Services Industries; Ed Brzytwa, the vice president of international trade at the Consumer Technology Association; Ben Connor, a partner at DTB AgriTrade; Kyle Johnson, director of trade policy at the Information Technology Industry Council; Douglas Petersen, deputy vice president for international trade at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PhRMA; and Alice Slayton Clark, senior VP of Trade Investment and Digital Policy at the U.S. Council of for International Business. We've asked our folks if we can weave in some of the questions that have already come in that relate to some of the topics that came up already with Angela that we didn't get to, so we'll weave some of those in. And folks, bear with us if we may try to stay on a couple minutes long if the conversation, we need to take a little extra time to get to everything. With that, turn it back over to you, Penny.
Great, thanks, Ken. So I think that was super helpful to hear from Angela. I wanted to start off actually, Ben, with you on agriculture, and also part because we've had quite a few questions come in on agriculture. So would kind of love your, hot take, your sense of the mood and how things were, particularly on that final day, and would just love your impressions on the various ag issues that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was there on behalf of the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for WTO Reform, which is a group of 14 different U.S. ag associations that are focused on WTO reform and want the WTO to be functional and be a place where we can negotiate rules and resolve disputes and all of that. So our two big priorities coming into the ministerial were one to create a work plan that would lead to balanced and holistic negotiations on agriculture priorities within the Committee on Agriculture. So dealing with things like market access, domestic support, export restrictions, and including the public stockholding issues that that India has raised in those contexts. But then our second biggest priority was to prevent. Our top priority, our second priority, was to prevent an outcome that would have fundamentally undermined the rules of the Agreement on Agriculture regarding agricultural price supports. And this is the issue that is often misleadingly referred to as public stockholding, because what it's really about is price support subsidies that lead to trade distortion, that have historically been the biggest source of trade distortion in agriculture. It was one of the biggest victories of the Uruguay round to have these kinds of policies disciplined and agriculture in general brought into the rules-based trading system. So what we wanted to see, new negotiations, things move forward. This is what the U.S. delegation was pushing for, a number of other countries. But by the end of by the last day, it had become pretty clear that India was, and a couple of other countries allied with it, we're not going to let the negotiations, a work plan move forward. That they were going to insist on the maximalist position on public stockholding and price supports, and so this had been a source of drama in the ministerial. The first day at the opening session, the ambassador from Thailand whose rice exporters and farmers are heavily impacted by India's policies, made an impassioned speech about how this has led to negative repercussions for their producers. India has gone from around 10% of global rice trade to 40+% because of these policies they have in place. And apparently the room applauded afterwards, developing and developed countries appreciating the intervention, but she ended up getting recalled for the end of the ministerial. This was a well-liked, well-respected diplomat who, I guess, touched the wrong buttons. So that was kind of set the tone for how the agriculture negotiations were going to go. And unfortunately, that was tied to other things as well. But that was kind of the mood on the ground. It seemed was I told folks on this call that it was deflated in the agriculture negotiations, and that, of course, because of the linkages that India has made, had spilled over into a number of other topics as well.
Great, thanks, Ben. I just want to be conscious there were quite a few questions about public stock taking, but also about how this might carry forward. Do you have any sense of, are they going to stick to this draft text I think Angela referenced, and I've seen the DG reference that, while they didn't come to any sort of agreement, they seem to be talking from a text that was a step forward. Is there a sense that that's how they're going to continue going forward, is to continue to work off that text, or will they take a step back and maybe chart another path forward based on the outcomes there?
So it was good news. I thought that there was a draft text that was, I think, leading in the right direction and was, had this kind of balanced and holistic look on the different issues, and it wasn't stuck in the old Doha framework that we haven't been able to move past for a long time. So I think that provided a real opportunity for a reset in the agriculture negotiations, which the United States and like-minded countries have been pushing for years now. But at the end of the day, unless India changes its strategies at the WTO, and just as an aside, I mean, India has incredible problems in their domestic agriculture sector that are in a lot of ways tied to their current regime, and so they put the blame on the developed countries on the WTO, but they haven't been challenged on those policies. The problems are internal, and if India wants to be a globally competitive trade global powerhouse, they need to fix their WTO strategy so that it aligns with their own domestic ambitions. So that leaves the rest of us kind of stuck with waiting for India to figure out how to be more constructive and how to align their trade interests better with their trade policies. And so, from our perspective, sure, we can talk about work plans still, but let's also look at other ways to raise the ambition in agriculture. Are there plurilateral configurations? Can we try to break the logjam the other way, in other ways, and get newer issues on the table than what we've been talking about for years? And so, I think there's a lot of creative ideas in Geneva. There's a lot of delegates from different countries who have done great work. We just need to find a way to get past this blockage. And to the extent that we're just relying on India to change their positions, I think we should try to explore new ways.
Great. Thank you, Ben. I want to turn now to the e-commerce moratorium and the e-commerce work plan. And I'm going to turn first to Christy Bliss from the Coalition of Service Industries, who was on the ground to the bitter end, I think, Christy. So I'm going to turn to you, and then I'll see if Ed and Kyle have comments or additional color to add. So turning it over to you.
Thanks very much. And really have appreciated the opportunity to be part of this group. And on the ground and live through the Abu Dhabi experience. So the e-commerce moratorium, I really want to pick up on both Ben's comments and Angela's. I think Angela's setting the backdrop of how difficult geopolitically things are definitely affected the ministerial, on top of the fact that so many countries, particularly prominent ones, are facing elections this year. And it's clear that very much influenced the atmosphere surrounding the e-commerce moratorium. To Ben's comment, as he explained the situation with agriculture, what happened was very quickly, although it was really India, South Africa, and Brazil and Indonesia that were objecting to extension of the moratorium. When it came down to brass tacks, it was really India was the one that really stood in the way. And they went just across the board and took hostages. And as Ben alluded, one of the hostages they took was the e-commerce moratorium, and just flat out said they would not agree to an extension. And what I think is important to realize is there was a lot of progress that's been made over the last year, and there was over a majority of WTO members, both developed and developing countries, that supported extension of the moratorium. In large part, I think, to all the studies that have been done, the discussions that have been held in the work program. So a lot of progress, particularly the fact that the Afro-Caribbean Pacific nations came out in support of the waiver or the moratorium. That was a huge step forward. So what you really ended up with was a large showing of support, but really came down to politics. And it came down to India being willing to literally blow up the ministerial because unless it got what it wanted on public stock holding. And so the atmosphere really became very poisoned. And it really was a cliffhanger, I would say, till the end. And we were not at all sure whether there would be any continuation of the moratorium until the last day. And it was as a result, really, of the intervention of the UAE Ambassador Tani, who made a personal plea for extension, and I'm sure had private discussions, informal discussions as well, with Minister Goyal. And then Minister Goyal held a press conference and said he was doing a favor for Ambassador Tani by agreeing to allow the moratorium to continue for another 2 years. The other thing I will say is that I think it's really important to read the language that was agreed to very carefully. It was worded to appease India. But the important thing is it does allow for the continuation of the moratorium for another 2 years till MC14 or March 31st, 2026, whichever is earlier. That was language that India wanted. It echoes the language in part that was in the MC12 decision. It also says that the moratorium and the work program will expire at MC at that point. What it does not include, and this is where the controversy I think has arisen, is it does not include the language that was included in MC12 unless ministers take a decision to extend. And I think what's really important from at least our perspective is that that doesn't mean that ministers can't decide at MC14 against expiration and a decision to continue the moratorium. It certainly sends, it's a red flag, it's a warning signal. We can't rest easy. But I think it's really important that there be an understanding of how that language be interpreted and what the opportunity that it does not eliminate. I think the other thing I would say is it really highlights the importance of redoubling our efforts to support work in the JSI to get work toward the largest possible support for a permanent e-commerce moratorium. And also just to work more actively generally on the work program elements and to understand the politics there on the pressure to come up with a scope and definition, work on capacity building. So let me stop there because I know others will want to add and Kyle will want to comment as well. But my takeaway is very poison atmosphere until the very end. And it just points to the weakness in the system that a single country can literally take hostage in the ministerial format and could have brought the ministerial down. And so we need to think going forward in terms of reform of the system, how to try to avoid that outcome. But let me let you turn to Ed and Kyle, their thoughts.
Great. Let me turn, Ed, let me turn to you. And one thing also, I mean, Krista, you talked about working on the JSI for e-commerce, but we heard earlier also that India is holding up the investment facilitation for development JSI. And so I understand that the e-commerce JSA may be the best next vehicle, but it seems to me that going to your discussion of the weaknesses, it may create a similar bargaining chip in the future for countries that want to get something else out of it. Ed, can I turn to you?
Yeah, I think Christy covered the ground quite well. I totally agree that the India situation is untenable, but I will cite a silver lining to all this. Maybe in the past, India could speak credibly for the developing world. MC13 just undercut that entirely. I think developing countries are sick and tired of India's nonsense at the WTO, and India really their reputation as a stakeholder, a responsible stakeholder of the WTO is in tatters. And I think that's something that we all need to think about going into MC14 in Cameroon. The developing countries in the e-commerce moratorium discussion showed that they are more than willing to look at this on the basis of facts and the basis of data, as opposed to just taking hostages and ignoring economic interests. And what was utterly clear to me was India completely ignored its economic interests and its trade interests when it comes to the moratorium. The other thing I'll cite is it's interesting. The U.S. isn't here, USTR isn't here. I mean, we would love to have them here, but I think behind the scenes, the United States played a very helpful role, even if outwardly they you didn't see a whole lot of demands for moratorium renewal by the United States. I think they privately said, yes, we support renewal, but it wasn't like at the top of the U.S. rhetorical agenda. So hats off and congratulations to the USTR negotiating team, because I think they did play a very helpful, crucial role behind the scenes. And the last thing I'll say is I am so impressed with the partnership between Dr. Tani and UAE and DG Ngozi. I mean, they were in lockstep the whole way, and they really brought this, to conclusion in a very notable way. And maybe, the press can say this was not successful, WTO's in crisis, but let's be honest, 166 members with countries like India trying to rule the roost. I feel like the WTO did make progress here, and the fact that the business community stood up in force this time means that we finally are waking up to the fact that if we don't show up, the WTO could disappear. And that's a conversation for a separate WITA event, Ken. I hope you're taking notes on that.
Thank you, Ed. Kyle.
Yeah, I would just add a few things. I mean, first, just to make it really clear, the extension of the moratorium, I think, is great news. And certainly we were all very supportive of that. And I think, as others have pointed out, the context and the background going into the ministerial was very challenging. And we knew this was going to be difficult for many reasons. And then as the week went on, it became clear that it would be maybe even more difficult than expected at the start. So there were a lot of challenges. It was not easy, certainly, but this was great news that this was extended. And I think, as Ed has already pointed out, there were a lot of delegations that get credit for that. But I think, just across the board, we saw the vast majority of delegations working very productively to advance outcomes, to get through what was possible, and to make sure that this did not lapse. So that's great. I think another observation, just kind of broader than just the moratorium, but I think that's kind of relevant here and was interesting. I think that we saw in these talks, we saw the rise of additional trade leaders, around the world, and we saw a number of delegations that were really instrumental in advancing other outcomes and talks. So Costa Rica, for example, was really instrumental in the services work that advanced. Guatemala has done a lot of work advancing the dispute settlement reform talks in recent years. I think it's great. And I think we saw across all these topics that we had a lot of delegations that were really leading and advancing these pivotal conversations. I think, as others have pointed out, that's instrumental to the future success and relevance of the WTO as an organization. We need additional countries. We need leaders, to advance these talks and to keep the work going. And I think, just to go back to the point that others have made, India certainly, but a few other delegations as well. There were some delegations that came into this meeting, looking to extract specific outcomes and undermined a lot of other outcomes that many others supported. I think that is it was very frustrating, certainly, and it's problematic for the organization. It'll be critical, that we don't wait until MC14, that the work happens now bilaterally, multilaterally, plurilaterally, to encourage these delegations to take a better approach in the WTO next time around. So, and the last thing I'd say is just, on the moratorium itself, the reason it got through, despite all these problems, is just because of how compelling and sound the case is for the importance of this moratorium in particular. There's been a lot of work that's been done in recent years, quantifying the impact, talking about alternatives in terms of policy approaches, just underlining how important this is to development around the world and to trade opportunities for companies of all sizes from all countries. There's no question of the logic of the value of the moratorium. I think that's ultimately why it was renewed. And I would say, just on a point of optimism, I think looking forward to MC14, I think that logic will only strengthen over the next 2 years. You know, the share of global trade that is digitally delivered is going to continue to increase. This is a significant part of the global economy. I can't imagine in 2 years the case for renewal of the moratorium will be less compelling than it was this time around. So I'm optimistic that we will continue to advance this dialogue and that this will be extended again. And then, you know, looking forward outside of MC14 too, I think that the advancement of some of the conversations on JSIs, on the plurilateral talks, that's very positive in terms of thinking of the e-commerce JSI work that's underway. So hopefully that's a sign that will be possible to implement and to advance that conversation as well later this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. And maybe if I could echo, I thought that the UAE was actually a very good host of this ministerial in a lot of different ways. On the ground, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle on the first day with a few NGOs and the UAE security. They had quite tight security coming into the center, but overall, I think they did an excellent job. And also provided a lot of support for a lot of initiatives financially that were going on. They made sure that every delegation was able to come to this ministerial and paid for those that couldn't afford it. So those are just some of the things they did to, I think, be very good and gracious host, as well as very substantive in the work that they were doing. With that, Douglas, I'm going to turn to you on TRIPS because we haven't heard much about that. And then, Alice, I'm going to let you close to talk a little bit about the environmental and climate issues and some of the work that's there. So, Douglas, let me turn to you on TRIPS and a lot of the very heated, hot work that was going on while you were there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. And apologies, I was not able to join the previous discussions, getting pulled in live to some developments. You know, I would just note, also, I would echo the comments of Christine and others on the e-commerce moratorium, that extension also is important for the biopharmaceutical sector. So we were pleased to see that as well. And I certainly share all of the sentiments of my colleagues here. But moving on to TRIPS, you know, I think, of course, you know, I think that the fact that is what the question opens up with, you know, that's very telling. So, and what I mean by that is, for our industry, my perspective here is that this ministerial was I would hardly characterize it as a success, but rather a sigh of relief. What we saw, of course, taking a step back, is that, you know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, intellectual property rules, based first and foremost in the TRIPS agreement and expanded out thereafter, they delivered. They brought us vaccines and therapeutics in record time. They enabled thousands of people to come to Abu Dhabi to take part in that ministerial conference. And yet what we saw at MC13, similar to MC12 before it, is that the topic of most relevance for our industry was seeking to dismantle that IP regime. And we had to, unfortunately, spend all of our time and resources combating, you know, an extension of the TRIPS waiver on vaccines to therapeutics and diagnostics. And I flag that because, you know, it really is the opportunity cost of what was missed out. You know, throughout the pandemic and even now, well, maybe I should note, you know, we did not need the COVID-19 pandemic to inform ourselves that governments imposing tariffs on imports of medicines for use by their own citizens is a bad idea. You know, imposing export restrictions on trade and pharmaceutical products is a bad idea. You know, and so on and so forth. Yet even the COVID-19 pandemic was not enough to change many governments' minds on those issues. And you know, that's really demoralizing. So we were, of course, very pleased to see that there was no expansion of the TRIPS waiver, but very disappointed that, you know, if not COVID, what is it going to take for the WTO to get serious about working on a proactive trade and health agenda, trying to reduce tariffs in medicines, reduce export restrictions, reduce other trade and regulatory barriers. It's very disappointing. And, Ed's comment, of course, relates here about, 160 plus members. So to some degree, this is not unexpected. I would just note the WTO pharmaceutical agreement went into place in 1994, was last updated in 2010. So in terms of expansion of scope of countries, scope of products, we're a whole decade and a half away from that. And it's really time for the WTO to get much more serious about this and move away from discussion in our industry sector just around trying to dismantle the intellectual property regime that has delivered. Maybe I would just close by noting, this is one area where what was not expected, both with MC13 and MC12, is, continued lack of leadership by USTR. I really want to emphasize that point. While they might have been very helpful behind the scenes on digital trade and some other files, we still saw an instance where this demagoguing talk of intellectual property rights from the United States is really a lack of leadership at the WTO. And it's something that other countries see and they're following, and it's leading us down really negative outcomes. We would like to see, now with the TRIPS waiver debate officially behind us, the WTO pick up the more constructive agenda, try working on the trade and health agenda, which predates the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'd like to see the United States get more involved. An easy place to start would be the United States joining the Ottawa Group proposals of other developed countries, trying to liberalize trade in biopharmaceutical and other health products. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks, Douglas. Alice, I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to turn to Alice at this stage. I didn't see any questions come in either, Douglas, but if I do, I'll turn those to you, or I'll return to you. Alice, do you want to provide comment on kind of where things landed on environment and climate change and some of the other topics that Angela referenced, I think, with regards to the future issues?
Sure, and thank you, Penny. I actually just wanted to kind of tee off of what everybody's been saying. Douglas brings up a good point. We are lauding outcomes that were really basically efforts to stave off backward momentum at the WTO. These are issues, the e-commerce moratorium, if it expires, duties can be imposed on electronic transmissions. And, if the TRIPS agreement is waived, is extended to diagnostics and therapeutics, this is a further unraveling of WTO rules. So it's kind of, I'm grateful for the outcomes. I'm grateful for the efforts that everybody made, and industry made a huge push. Echoing what Ed said, industry was there in force, U.S. industry especially. So I think that really helped. I think the work that was done over the last couple of years to make sure that these things were not eroded at the WTO were very instrumental. And we've got our work cut out ahead of us, because one of my observations generally from attending in Abu Dhabi is that you see the rising voice of some of these countries that feel that the WTO is not delivering. And in the ministerial statement, if you read it, you see references and nods to, extending flexibilities in the state of emergencies. And I just don't know where that leads. It's sort of the basis for why they were trying to extend the TRIPS waiver. It's the basis for some of the issues we're encountering with the e-commerce moratorium. It's bridging the digital divide, giving them policy space to address issues on their digital development. So I think we've got to be very careful as industry moving forward to be on the lookout for how they really flesh out what they mean by extending flexibilities. In terms of the outcomes in the environment, basically the WTO is moving forward very steadily with a structured dialogue, if you will, on the environment. They call it the TESD, and the MC13 really provided an opportunity to stock take and develop and issue a work plan for moving forward towards MC14. So we expect to see a lot of work to be done in the months ahead as we approach 2026. And this is a good development. What's great about the structured dialogue is that it provides an opportunity to take some of these really difficult issues at the intersection of trade and environment and take them offline so that it's not part of a negotiation. It's not part of any sort of formal process. It's considered a dialogue where industry can be in the room, which is a huge opportunity for companies, because at the WTO, there's no formal role for the industry voice. So I think this is a great place for any of the companies here to weigh in, have an impact, and be able to advance some of the best practices that you're leading in some of these areas on circularity, on climate issues, on plastics. I mean, all that stuff. Our companies at USCIB and beyond, U.S. is in the lead because we're innovative leaders in the world. So I think this is a positive part to the WTO. These are issues that need to be addressed. They've issued now work plans moving forward in all the areas on circularity, on climate, and how to deal with trade-related climate measures, subsidies relating to fossil fuels, very challenging, circular economy, best practices, transparency. I mean, this goes beyond just trade standard setting, waste management, all sorts of collateral and broader issues being brought into the discussion. And then, of course, a lot of us have been very supportive in the past and would like to see progress on some sort of renegotiation of restart of the negotiations on the environmental goods and services agreement, adding the services component. So that's also being discussed. One of the key things that's also important about the environmental discussions is they're trying to rationalize some of the work that's being done in other international organizations in this realm. So stuff that's going on at the United Nations on plastics, for example, the WTO is trying to incorporate all of that good work that's being done in those areas, but making sure that it's cohesive and that it makes sense and that they're not overstepping in certain areas. So it's a good area for stock taking and making sure we have alignment and not some fragmented and irrational approach to some of these issues. So the other thing about the environment work stream that raises an issue that I think we've all touched upon a little bit here is the role of plurilaterals at the WTO. If they were to advance the environmental discussions into negotiations at some point, everybody expects that this would be approached in a plurilateral way. We definitely see that as sort of the best move forward on some of these issues that we're addressing today. Multilateral negotiations get so bogged down. Maybe it's best to start with the willing and try to move forward on some of these more challenging areas. Digital is one of them, and you see that in the JSI on e-commerce. But also, I think you'll see that with respect to the environment work streams as well. So anything we can do to shore up the WTO with respect to getting plurilaterals accepted as an institutional process is very important. As you do see India and some of the others blocking plurilaterals because they don't like being outside the room when it comes to these discussions on harder issues. And so what they're gonna do instead is just block them. So that's one area where I think we really need to do some work. Why don't I stop it there because I can see we're running up on time.
Yeah, I think, Alice, we saw also while we were there's a group called Trade Ministers for Climate, that there's 60 countries that, including the United States, that have signed up for and supporting a lot of these environmental issues and the climate-related issues. I will note that one of the UN agencies had a big plastics conference going on at the exact same time as MC13. So one of the first things they've discussed that they need to do is coordinate calendars to make sure that we're not running two similar but competing events at the same time so that people can attend and be present for each of those. So with that, I think we're coming up on the end. I wanted to see if there's any final comments before I turn it back to Ken. I didn't see any new questions come in. And I think we've answered all the ones we can, Ken, that are in the box. So if we didn't get to your question, I apologize. I know there were a few that came in for Angela right at the end, but we'll catch them next time.
Any final words, though, from anybody who maybe from other comments? Christy, I see you just unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to a question that Penny raised at when we were talking about the e-commerce moratorium, but then it's been threaded through various discussions. And that is that on the plurilateral side of things, I think it's important that there be maybe a deeper understanding of what we're talking about here, because there was a reason that the e-commerce, or rather the domestic reg text got through. There was a legal difference because of the way the commitments were taken on, that India and South Africa ultimately dropped their objection. That's in contrast to the model of trying to do plurilaterals as an Annex 4 agreement, which they're not likely to drop their objection to. So weaving back to the JSI and the permanent e-commerce moratorium, which I think you referenced, Penny, in your question, one other idea would be, alongside trying to work forward creatively and how we might surmount that obstacle, is for the like-minded countries to do a political level commitment, to the extent that they're willing to all adhere to saying, okay, we won't impose duties on e-commerce, and just collectively. So just wanted to mention that as another thought to throw out there.
I'll add one additional thought. It was clear to me, especially in like the final 2 days, that the issue set for ministers was so small compared to past ministerials. It made the trade-offs far more minuscule, very apparent. I think the United States, we should start having a conversation about what a U.S. offensive agenda at the WTO should look like, because it was clear we've been in a defensive crouch for years and years now without actually defining what we want from an offensive market opening perspective. And I'll build on what Douglas said earlier. It's been since 2015 since the WTO Information Technology Agreement was updated. That was an expansion of the product scope of the original ITA from 1997. And we've been very clear that there should be another product expansion. It was supposed to happen in 2018. It did not happen. And I think there's plenty of stuff that U.S. industry has asked for in the past that just never made it across the finish line. We should revive those conversations.
Any other final words? Not seeing any hands going up or lines unmuted.
Just thank you, Ken and WITA, for all your organization of this.
Delighted, glad we were able to do it. Glad we were able to pull folks on. Thank you, all of you who joined us from Abu Dhabi. Those were fun to do. You really gave us a flavor for what was happening both in the room but outside the room, and you did again today. And that's the kind of insights we love to be able to share with our members and our viewers. So thank you. We do have a discussion ongoing with USTR to try to bring them in to talk about their plans and thoughts about the WTO, both the ministerial and going forward. So stay tuned. Hopefully we can announce something about that. Thank you so much, Penny, Christine, Kyle, Ed, Ben, Alice, and Douglas. Really appreciate all of you so much and look forward to having you all on again soon. Thanks very much. Take care, everybody. And for those of you who are still jet lagged, get some rest.